All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry, we're dealing with a few issues opening this session today, but thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining. Today's topic that we're going to be talking about are tips for your initial client meetings, and as well as drafting declarations and witness statements. Now, this information today is more geared towards asylum applications for Afghan OAW/OAR applicants. However, most of these tips can usually be used across whatever populations you're serving. So we just want to be able to help practitioners and providers in the field. And so welcome. My name is Chelsea Mack. I am the mentoring attorney for Afghan projects with Vicina. Today, my co-presenter is Jenny Guilfoyle, who is the legal director for Vicina. Vicina is hosting this in collaboration with the Welcome Legal Alliance, and we thank them for their support in this meaningful work. So today, the information we are going to discuss are again, just information on how to best approach your initial client meeting with your applicant, with your client in the first few times that you're meeting with them, what type of expectations to set with them. Also, then discussing the declaration, what is a declaration, the purpose of it, how to draft the declaration, what tips to remember, what important points to include, and then also just discussing information about witness statements. Some of you all may have questions about that, whether or not you should include them, what type of information those should entail. So we just want to be able to provide all of that information to you. And at the end of this session, we plan to have a few minutes near then for Q&A. So we're asking if you have any questions, if you can just type those into the Q&A box. We're going to attempt to answer some of them throughout typing back to you during the presentation, but we will be able to hopefully answer a few live if we have a few minutes near the end. And so I think that is all the information. So I will let Jenny begin.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you all for being here with us today. We're excited to talk through all of this with you. So we want to start at the very beginning of the representative-client relationship, the initial client meeting. And Chelsea mentioned that at Vicina, we work with a lot of pro bono volunteers who are very generously volunteering their time to take on Afghan affirmative asylum cases. And many of the pro bono attorneys that we work with maybe have never worked with an immigrant client before, never worked with an asylum seeker, or don't really do a lot of client meetings. And so often have a lot of questions for us about what is the purpose of the initial client meeting, what kind of questions should you be asking, what should you be doing in that meeting? So that's kind of why we wanted to start with this. The initial client meeting, of course, is obviously the way that you kick off the representative-client relationship. And what are some of the goals that you might have in that initial meeting? So there might be a number of different things that you want to do during that meeting. Obviously, you want to meet your client and his or her family. And given the circumstances of the evacuation from Afghanistan, we are seeing that many Afghan evacuees are here with extended family members and may come to meet with you as a group, which might be a little bit different than many other asylum seekers that you might meet with. There's a higher proportion, I think, of family groups, just again, given the circumstances of the evacuation. So if you are working with an Afghan client, it's quite possible that you're going to be meeting not just with one person, but with a number of people from the same family, all at the same time. What you also want to do in that meeting, a really important thing that you want to make sure that you cover in the initial client meeting, is establishing the representative-client relationship. And often that's an attorney, but you also might be an accredited representative. So, and we may have some accredited reps on the line today. So you want to establish that relationship between the representative and the client, and sign a written representative-client agreement. And that's something that that everybody should be doing, to have a standard agreement that you sign with clients that lay out kind of what work you're agreeing, clearly lay out what work you're agreeing to do, discuss the representation and how it will work, what the rights and responsibilities are, both of the representative and of the client. I always like to read through those with my clients. I've found that if I hand my clients, as an attorney sitting there in a position of more power than my clients have, if I hand my clients an agreement and say, this is our representative client agreement, please sign it, please read it, I'm not sure that they always really read it or understand it. And I find that it's really important and can help set the tone for the representation generally to make sure that your clients understand what's in the agreement and that they feel empowered to ask any questions that they have. So I always like to read through that with my clients. It also might be, though, that you might not always have the ability to do that, but you might want to make sure that you have it translated then into your client's best language. So if you're working with Afghans, that might mean having a version in Dari and Pashto readily available, and then really giving your clients space and making sure that they feel like it's okay to ask any questions about this. So you definitely want to make sure that agreement is signed there. And then really set expectations for the case process and the representative client relationship. So another thing that I really like to do in that first meeting is talking through why the person is there to see me and what they're hoping for, what outcome they're hoping for, what kind of case they're interested in pursuing. And then, assuming that that's going to be an asylum case, because that's what we're talking about here, I like to give my clients expectations for, number one, how the asylum process itself works overall, and what's involved in putting together an asylum application and what happens at the interview and who makes decisions on the asylum application, kind of talking that through with them. But then also talking about the work that we're going to be doing together and what that's going to look like and what that's going to mean for the client and the kind of work that you're going to be doing together, a lot of which is drafting the declaration, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the webinar, but also, of course, filling out the Form I-589, gathering evidence, prepping the client for the interview. So I like to talk through together what that's going to look like and kind of what the client can expect from me and what I expect from the client. And talking, I think at this point is a good time too to talk about what your client's schedule is, when you might be able to, what's the best way to reach your client, how much time you're going to need, kind of figuring out together how you're going to make sure that you have the time together that you need in the future to do the work on the case. And all of this goes toward the important goal of starting to build trust and rapport with your client, which is another really important part of this initial meeting. And then, depending on how much time all these other things take, you may start start actually gathering facts for your client's case. One thing I will say about kind of going back to my first point about the family members is that, again, you may well find that you have a family that has numerous people who may be principal applicants, and they all come together and they're all kind of telling their story together, which can be absolutely fine for the first meeting. But once you kind of figure out who are going to be the principal applicants, you're going to be needing to make clear to the family that you're going to need to meet with each individual principal applicant on their own, and that each of them is going to have to develop their own case on their own. You can certainly coordinate things between the family, and you'll also want to make sure you discuss with the family issues about confidentiality and the extent to which they're willing to let you share information between members of the same family. They may or may not want that. And so it's important, again, the first meeting or maybe the first two meetings may include lots of people from the family, but then as you work with each principal applicant, everyone's going to need to develop their own case on their own because they're all going to be interviewed separately. And I think that's a really important point to make to applicants who may not realize that and may think that all that's necessary is for the family to kind of put forth a story. And so it's important to make sure that you're stressing from the beginning that each principal applicant has to develop their own case, and it's going to be interviewed on their own. In terms of when to schedule that initial meeting, that's something you want to do as soon as possible. Make sure that you schedule adequate time to do that you coordinate with an interpreter. But it's really important to get the case started as possible. People are very anxious to have their cases started. And, as I think many of you are aware, if you're working on Afghan cases, the clock is ticking. People were paroled generally starting in August of 2021 for 2 years. So we're getting to the place where people's parole will start expiring within 6 months. So it's really important to get these cases filed quickly at this point. So you want to make sure you schedule that meeting as quickly as possible. In terms of an interpreter, and Chelsea's going to talk in just a minute about working with an interpreter, it's definitely important to make sure that you have an interpreter there for the first meeting. If you think you're going to need one, that also may be something that you'll assess during the first meeting, the extent to which you think you're going to need an interpreter going forward, and to assess what the client's best language is. So with that, turn back to Chelsea.
So yeah, when working with your client, you may realize that an interpreter is going to be necessary. For many of your clients, they may actually have a good knowledge and understanding of English. However, when it comes to them describing their own fear of returning to Afghanistan, describing the details of the asylum claim, especially getting into some of maybe the more emotional or traumatic parts of their story, they're probably going to be much more comfortable speaking their own language. So we definitely encourage you to establish working with an interpreter early if you think that that's going to be necessary during the asylum interview. And that's also just to make sure that their asylum application is going to be as complete as possible, and just including all the information that's going to be needed. So when working with an interpreter, definitely consider using a non-family member as an interpreter. In many cases, you'll likely have some family members, maybe older family members, the parents, for example, who may not be as fluent in English or have any English knowledge, but maybe their children do, the adult children do. And so as supportive as the children may want to be, or an older sibling, or even a younger sibling, they may want to step in and interpret. And, we appreciate that support. However, we do realize that the closer interpreter is to not only the client, but also to the story, they may want to unintentionally add in information, more so to try to clarify if they realize that maybe the client is not understanding the question being asked or explaining all the necessary details. They may kind of add that in, or adjust even the questions that you're asking. And so it's important to make sure that, if possible, to try to work with an interpreter that is not a family member, that's not connected to the case or to the client. Again, we do realize that may be nearly impossible for certain clients in certain cases, but if you can even get a family friend, it may be much better for you and your team. So before beginning work with the client, make sure the interpreter is able to confirm their language compatibility. Different parts of Afghanistan most likely have maybe different dialects or pronounce things differently, have, just a different way of speaking whichever language. And so making sure that your client is comfortable understanding the interpreter and speaking with the interpreter. Also, this is a good time to establish whether or not the client may prefer a certain gender of an interpreter. I know sometimes we get requests that a female client wants a female interpreter. So that's good to establish that and to ask those types of questions, especially in that initial client meeting, or when you're starting to prepare for that initial client meeting, asking the client if they do have a preference, because in some cases the information may be really sensitive, and particularly if it's a female client, they may not feel as comfortable speaking to a male interpreter through certain things, even if you, as the attorney, as a credit representative, as a staff member supporting the attorney or representative, even if you are female, they may still hold back. So just definitely considering that along with the language compatibility. And then also working with the interpreter, it's important just to set expectations. So letting the interpreter know that you expect them to interpret exactly what you are saying and exactly what the client is saying to you, that they're not adding anything, that they're not adjusting anything, that they're not bolstering or clarifying anything. There's going to probably be many points throughout the entire preparation process for the application as well as the interview that there may be some confusion on certain details that were shared or questions that were asked. Definitely tell the interpreter to pause and tell you if the client responds a certain way that they know is not appropriate. For example, if you're asking what is your best language and they're responding that their family lives in Kabul, that obviously it was not the appropriate question, or I'm sorry, response. But it's important that the interpreter tells you what they responded to first. So that way, whether or not you need to repeat the question or rephrase the question for them, it may be easier. And it just helps to prepare them for working with an interpreter during the asylum interview. So setting expectations with the interpreter about how they should be interpreting, if they do need to be reaching out to the client or helping you reach out to the client, knowing what type of communication is appropriate, and whether or not like setting up certain meetings or certain time frames, just making sure that the interpreter knows that they are really a means of communication and they're not necessarily taking on the representative role for the client is important. And then also, I know that we've shared it with in some of our previous sessions, and especially with this session last month about interpreters, but we always like to just reemphasize it. When you are working with an interpreter, make sure you and the client know that you need to take many pauses throughout all of the communication. So only speaking 2 or 3 sentences at a time is important, and then pausing to allow the interpreter to interpret what was said, and that way the interpreter can keep up with the information being shared. So we always like to reemphasize that, but just make sure taking a lot of pauses. So we just talked a little bit about setting expectations with the interpreter, but also it's important to set expectations with your client. I know Jenny mentioned a few of those details at the beginning, but just making sure that they understand your role as the attorney or accredited representative, understanding that you are basically the one that is providing this form of representation for them, that you are the one that is preparing this application on their behalf, that basically that you're the one that has received or is received or you are receiving currently the training, the adequate knowledge and preparation in order to properly prepare their application and prepare them for their interview. Knowing that you do have legal standards to meet, and that you are basically the one that's kind of controlling what's happening in the sense of just making sure that it meets with all the legal standards of asylum law. Also, this is just the time for them to also know too, as I'm sure it may come up, there's also many times many different issues and concerns that are a little bit outside of the scope of the legal relationship, especially if there's maybe questions about like certain medical benefits or other type of social services that may be needed by the client or by the family members. It definitely is time to explain to them that, you may, depending on your knowledge and your outreach, your network, you may be able to connect them with those appropriate resources. However, this is not necessarily the proper space to bring up questions if, they're, again, asking about maybe certain medical benefits or something, that you can direct them towards those services, but this will be the time that you're preparing them for their asylum application. Also discussing with them the different steps of the case and the timeline. So providing this overview of stating that, here at the beginning, we're getting to know each other. We're starting to build this rapport with one another, that we're starting to understand the details of your case so that we can properly prepare your asylum application, and that will involve the Form I-589, as well as the declaration and any other support documentation, that all of this is going to be provided to then submit to USCIS so that the asylum office can receive that information and then schedule them for an interview, and that you're going to then prepare them for the interview. Once all of that preparation is done, they will then attend an interview. And once an interview is complete, then they will just need to wait for a decision as far as figuring out whatever next step will be needed, hopefully a grant, but whatever next step is needed. So making sure that they understand how this looks, that they most likely will take several months. It's not necessarily a quick process, and that they just should know this ahead of time, help them, probably put them a little bit more at ease and understanding that even though things may seem to be moving slow, that it actually is pretty much on track for the normal timeline for these types of cases. Also, just discussing your client's involvement with providing whatever necessary case details and evidence for their case. I know from my experience, sometimes I would have clients that would somehow expect me to have all of the answers or all the knowledge about their case. And as I'm sure many of you who are working with your clients and getting to know them even now, most likely you just met them very recently, whether within the last few months, the last few weeks, or even days. And so, unfortunately, you do not have all their knowledge or information about their past. Yes, you can create and document all the different country conditions information, but you don't know the specific details of their case. And so there is some responsibility on their part in order to help participate in this process of preparing their application. So they need to provide all the necessary details. They need to be the ones that really are expressing their fear, expressing exactly who it is that they're afraid of, what types of events maybe happened in their past, what do they know is currently happening to them or family, things that they expect to be happening in the future. If they've gone to the hospital in the past, that they need to be the ones that, if they happen to have the reports for that, that they're the ones that are going to be going to try to retrieve those, or proof of any employment in the past in Afghanistan or with a U.S. organization. So just making sure that they understand that they very much play a very important role in preparing this application. And just because you are the attorney accredited representative, that you really rely on their participation to complete this. And then lastly, we just want to encourage many of you all, especially if this is your first time taking on an asylum case or anything with immigration, just be confident in your counsel abilities. I know it can be very nerve-wracking, especially working with someone if you're not used to working with someone in a different culture, that there are different cultural concerns, or, just understanding what asylum law is like, or, maybe afraid of possibly messing up. But you are very prepared for this. And I'm sure as some of you all are going on, you're probably receiving a lot of mentoring from organizations that you're working with. And so we just encourage you that, you are a licensed attorney or an accredited representative for a reason. And so you are adequately prepared to do this work. And so now with that, I'm going to turn over to Jenny, who will discuss some of the information about declarations.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsea. So we want to move now to talking about the heart of the work that you're going to be doing with your asylum applicant client, other than filling out the I-589. And that is really filling out the declaration, which is your client's opportunity to tell their story on paper, and to set out all the important facts of the case. And really, the rest of the case is going to be built around the declaration. That's going to be the heart of the case, because an asylum case depends on somebody's personal story of what's already happened to them or what they're afraid is going to happen to them, and information about them personally that they think would make them a target for persecution. This is also your client's, so it's an important way to get evidence into the case and to let the asylum officer know what the case is about. It also helps the officer really understand who your client is before your client even walks into the asylum office. and allows your client to really tell their story in a way that conveys facts, but also emotion, which is very important for asylum cases, which of course are built on fear of persecution. It also helps you, as you draft the declaration with your client, figure out what kind of supporting evidence you're going to need to support your client's assertions in the declaration. And it gives the officer an overview of what to expect. So I'm actually going to turn now to kind of what details, so what should go into this declaration, and then we're going to talk about kind of how to go about drafting it. So you're going to want some background details about your client, like their name, their date of birth, where they were born, what ethnic group they were in, where they grew up, their family relationships, but I would tend to keep that fairly short, unless there's something really, really important in there about your client that leads to their fear of persecution. Really, the rest of the declaration should focus on details that are relevant to the asylum claim. So always keeping in the back of your mind what you need to prove for an asylum claim, that your client either has faced persecution in the past and or has a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So if your client has suffered any kind of past harm that's related to one of those 5 categories, that should go into the declaration. And if there's any reasons that your client has to fear in the future harm on the basis of one of those 5 categories of reasons, that should go into the declaration. Also, you really want to make sure that you are conveying not just facts, but also the emotional import of those facts. And for instance, many people who were evacuated from Afghanistan may have gotten threats, death threats from the Taliban. Maybe they did personally, maybe their family members did. And so death threats themselves sometimes can even rise to the level of past persecution, but you'll really want to convey how serious these threats were. What was the emotional reaction of your clients and their family members to getting these threats? So kind of always keeping that in mind. Or if the Taliban, say, came and searched your client's house or the family house, I've seen that many times in declarations without sort of any further elaboration. That might have been a really terrifying, even potentially violent or threatening experience. It can be helpful, really helpful, to pull those kinds of details out in your client's declaration. Your client should also make sure that they address in their declaration that they're afraid to return and why, because that's a requirement for asylum, that you need to express a fear of return, which is pretty simple, just saying, I'm afraid to go back because I think X would happen to me. It's also really helpful if there have been any recent events since your client left Afghanistan that would add to his or her fear of persecution, that you address that in there. So if there have been threats or harm to family members, the Taliban has come looking for your client or threatened or harmed their family, that's absolutely something to include in the declaration. What should you not include in the declaration? I would say it's certainly a good idea to try to keep the declaration on the concise side. And one set of details that I'm always very, very, very cautious about is including exact dates and numbers for things in declarations. Why? Because the asylum office, one of the ways that they assess your client's credibility is always an issue for every asylum application. One of the ways they do that is by looking at what your client submitted on paper and comparing that to what your client says in the interview. And it can be really hard for people to remember exact dates, especially like Afghanistan doesn't use the same calendar, and people aren't necessarily as concerned with things like birthdays or dates for things as we might be in America. So there's a good chance that even if your client gives you a date during a meeting, that they may not remember that exact date during the interview. So why pin your client down to something that they won't remember? Or similarly, kind of like providing exact numbers, like 4 Taliban members came to our house. They might remember that differently at the interview, not because they're lying, but just because they're humans. So I'm always extremely cautious around those things and will hedge bets by saying things like around 2019 or a few months later, or a few Taliban members came to the house, or the kind of words that give some indication of like how many and when without pinning my client down to something really specific. And of course, this is a client specific consideration. I have had a few clients who seem to have photographic memories where I wasn't concerned about that, but for most people I would be. So just a word of caution there about what not to necessarily include. And there's no requirement that you include exact dates in the declaration. So how to go about drafting this? So there's not only one way to do this, but I like to think about this. This is really your client's own testimony on paper. So how do you make sure that it's really your client's testimony in your client's voice? I like to draft these by sitting with my client, asking questions, and I'll just be typing, and I'll tell them what I'm doing, why I'm doing this, and why I'm typing, and just type down literally verbatim what they say. I will leave out things that I think are irrelevant, but I'll pretty much sit there and like, this is the way they're explaining their story. I will then ask follow-up questions for more details. But that way I'm really capturing my client's own voice, which I think certainly for the asylum officer reading it, it makes it feel more like a real human person. It's also that way you're really sure that it's the best way to be sure. I think that what's written on the paper is what's most likely to come out of your client's mouth at the interview, and not, if you're explaining things for them, they might not explain things that way. I will then, after one meeting where I go through this kind of exercise, and depending on someone's story and language capabilities and time, I may or may not get through the whole story in one meeting, but then we'll come back. And in between before my next client meeting, I will look through it, kind of pull out the things that I think are really irrelevant, rearrange things in a chronological order that makes sense, because often people aren't necessarily answering your questions or telling things in a chronological order. And then making myself notes about like where are the places that I need to ask follow-up questions. And then in the next meeting, we'll go through, I'll ask follow-up questions. It's also super important to make sure that you read this over. Your client here's the whole thing word for word before they sign it. And I find that inevitably there'll be things where like, I didn't understand them correctly, or they forgot something, or there'll always be changes. So you absolutely want to make sure that your client has had this read to them in their native language before they sign it. Again, there's not one right or wrong way to do this. It's certainly possible that your client could just read through a translated version of this, and that could work. You're really going to have to make that call depending on your client. But I always want to I feel like the best way to be absolutely certain that they really paid attention to every sentence is by reading through it together, which of course is somewhat time consuming, so it may not work for everyone, but I find that it's the best way to make sure that they're really aware of everything that's in there. It's certainly possible to ask your client also to draft their own declaration, to start off doing that, and then to build on that. Often clients don't necessarily know exactly what's the most useful things to focus on, but for some people that might be a good way to proceed. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Chelsea to talk about kind of a little bit more in depth of like what kind of questions to ask as you're drafting this with your client.
So it's important just to really cover as much information as possible, because similar to what Ginny said, you can take down whatever details and then kind of go back and craft it to make sure it's more of a cohesive statement. But it's important to talk about, or to ask questions about, I should say, the background information. So where were they born? Where did they live before Afghanistan or after Afghanistan, if they've gone back and forth? Are they married? Do they have any children? If they do have children, are the children here in the US? Or if they're not, where are they? What is their ethnic group? What is their religion? These types of details are really important to help build the case, because based on, especially with a lot of these Afghan cases, based on certain details such as ethnic group or religion, it may lead directly to arguments for protected ground. Also discussing questions about their fear of returning to Afghanistan. So who are they afraid will hurt them exactly? What things happened to them in the past? Did anyone hurt them in the past, or did anyone threaten them in the past? If so, what happened? All the details related to that event. Please know with most of this information, especially when it comes to more of the sensitive information, more of the traumatic details that they may need to share, they are probably not going to be as upfront with the information. They may not necessarily know what they can share, what they should share. Just maybe, very emotional to share that information. So just encourage your client. Just always re-emphasizing that it's a safe space, that the information they're sharing with you is confidential. The information that you will share then with the US government is also confidential per asylum laws and regulations. And so just making sure that they are comfortable sharing their story and that they share all the details, because you have to be able to know everything that happened to them or everything that they are afraid of in order to best support their case and argue on their behalf. Also discussing information about things that could bar your client from asylum. So this is information about any involvement with the Taliban or terrorist organizations, any criminal background or information. They need to be addressed in your communication with your client, but not necessarily in the declaration. Again, some of this information, it will end up in the declaration. Other things may not, but it's just good to ask all of these questions at the beginning. The declaration should be done at the beginning of your asylum application process rather than at the end. So asking these types of questions, because it may lead to you having to go into further arguments or research for your case. And yeah, so if questions asking like, have you ever helped the Taliban in any way? Have you ever supported a terrorist organization? Very similar questions to what will be asked during the asylum interview. These are the types of questions to ask now. Also discussing questions about how their political and or religious beliefs may differ from the Taliban. And we are going to just share kind of an example of what we're talking about there, but any information that would show exactly how the Taliban would view them as different or opposing, like opposing parties or enemies, and how they would be targeted is important, even if say they share the same religion as the Taliban, there still can be an argument for them. So just really digging into that, or digging into how they practice their religious beliefs, or how that is shown, how their faith is shown, how they express that is important. And then, with all of this information, we're just going to continuously share, make sure you share as many details as possible, that you ask your client for as many details as possible, but really avoid pinning your client to any dates or details that they wouldn't know or won't be able to recall during the interview. If there's any doubt about it, just leave it out or approximate. So for example, if instead of saying in March 2018, the Taliban threatened my father, you could say several years ago, I think it was maybe near the beginning of the year, the Taliban threatened my father. So it still gives the same point about the threat by the Taliban to the specific individual, but it's not pinning down dates that may end up causing inconsistency issues and credibility issues later. So just to discuss a little bit more about the political or religious practices and beliefs and how those may differ from Taliban. This is kind of a little snippet of an example that you could maybe include in the declaration. And we've put this on here, and we do know that some people may not necessarily follow the instruction, but we just ask that you not copy this exactly. This is really more so meant as a template, just to give you an idea. All the declarations should always be unique to your client's facts. We do realize some of these things may be similar. So again, just to give you an idea of how to word or what types of things to ask for. And I'm just going to read this mainly because in case someone's listening, but not necessarily able to read the screen. The Taliban sees us as a separate religion. That is how they justify killing us. They say that we are infidels, that if we help the US in any way or have connections to people who help the United States, if I returned to Afghanistan and if I was allowed to leave the Kabul airport, I'd have to follow the Taliban's religious rules I don't believe in. For example, I don't always wear a hijab while living in the US. If I return to Afghanistan and walk down the street like this, I would be a target for the Taliban because women are now required to wear a full burqa. I would also be required to always be accompanied by a male family member while traveling outside my home. I want to finish my university degree, but I could not do that in Afghanistan. The Taliban does not let you practice any different interpretation of Islam. So from the information that was gathered, probably from the questions about their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, you're able to now form it and put it into this expression, this written statement explaining how my religious beliefs, my political beliefs are different from the Taliban. They're viewed differently. They're viewed in a negative light, and therefore it may cause me to become a target for the Taliban for future persecution. And this is how they can build the case. As you can probably tell, this one would probably be best for women, these types of ideas or beliefs, statements, but you can do very similar things with male applicants as well. And so again, and some of this is just to summarize, but just tips to remember while drafting the declaration. The declaration should be written in your client's voice, similar to what Ginny said a few moments ago. This should sound like your client is writing this, not you. Your client is likely not an attorney in the US or an accredited representative. And so there's only so much information that they can share, and only so many ways they can craft their declaration that doesn't necessarily sound like a legal professional in the US. Yes, your team assisted and probably put a lot of work and effort into the declaration, but it is your client's story at the end of the day. So it needs to sound like their words, use their words when possible. But make sure that it expresses your client's fear and their emotions. This is the time for them to put all their emotions on paper, and it gives the asylum officer the overview of what to expect during the interview. This is their time to share it, because sometimes during the interview, they may not remember all of the details, and they may become too emotional to share things verbally. So it's really a good time to put it down on paper, but to make it a narrative, a story. Make sure it's a detailed declaration, but succinct. Sometimes we're receiving declarations of 10, 15 plus pages. Telling you, no, that's way too long of a declaration unless the facts of your client's case really need that length of information. Most likely not. And with the asylum officers, especially those former asylum officers that we're working with regularly, a lot of them tell us that they don't have much time to go through this information. And so they do really like the declarations, but they don't have time to read 10, 15, 20 page declarations, plus, all the other information for every single applicant. So making things as succinct as possible is very helpful. It also will help you as the attorney or credit representative be able to share their story in a much more direct way, and not necessarily like piecing together unnecessary details. All facts should also be consistent with the form. Make sure that you are just checking with everything that they're sharing, especially if they're talking about dates or certain events, threats, physical harm, injuries that they endured, anything like that, making sure that everything is consistent. The asylum officer will be checking for credibility at all times. And so their declaration should be as clear as possible and as consistent as possible. And then we just always like to remind providers and practitioners to just be patient while drafting the declaration. This part of the process can be very traumatic for clients to retell their stories. Some very terrible things happen to some of these clients and possibly will happen in the future. And so it may take some time to get through the details of the story. And interpretation does add time as well, especially if you are working with an interpreter and relying on the interpreter. So just know whenever you're scheduling time for working on this, that it may take some time, not only working with the client, but even afterwards, to make sure that that declaration is complete. Now, Ginny is going to just give some details about the witness statement.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And so we want to spend the rest of our time now talking about witness statements, because those can also be a really helpful part of an asylum application. And what is the reason that you might? And plenty of people submit asylum applications without witness statements. So just know that it is by no means required. It's always something in every case that you're going to be thinking like, is this something that would be helpful? And why would you want to submit one? Well, oftentimes to corroborate your client's testimony, especially if it's an important part of the story and there's no other way to corroborate that. And that could be any number of things. It might be details of threats. For instance, if your client is worried about threats maybe that were made to other family members, maybe one of those other family members could actually write something about that to help corroborate that and provide even more details. So it can corroborate, it could provide more details that maybe your client doesn't have access to. Something else that comes up is that there are many Afghans who don't necessarily have civil documents about their marriages or the birth of their children. And so you may need to be looking at some kind of a witness statement to corroborate even a marriage, showing that, somebody who was actually at your client's wedding or has personal knowledge of it. So again, this is by no means required, doesn't have to be there in every case, but can be really helpful. You can actually bring a witness to the asylum office for an asylum interview. That's possible to do. It's certainly not required, so the asylum office will certainly accept witness statements without having to have the witness there. It's very different from, say, going to immigration court. But you can bring a witness along, and if you thought that the witness was really, really important and would add a lot, you could. But it is also, just so you know, up to the asylum officer to decide whether or not they're going to actually talk to the witness, which they may well not. I think it's actually somewhat unusual that they do, but you can do that. So what should go into a witness statement? And we can cover that on the next slide. So when there's a credible witness who supports your client's case, you'll want to include details about that in the witness statement. So you'll want to approach the witness statement from the perspective of like, what is it that this person has personal knowledge of? Because that's what a witness is going to be doing here, unless you're including an expert witness statement, which is something different that we're not actually covering during this training. Really, here we're talking about witnesses who have personal knowledge of facts in your client's case. So there, again, you'll be thinking, what are the important facts that I need corroborating? And does this person have personal knowledge of them? And if so, you're going to want them to write out what is their personal knowledge of the events in question. Certainly, this is something you're going to want to discuss with your client, and also make sure that there's not like additional concerns or questions that might be raised with the asylum officer if you do submit this particular witness statement. Absolutely, you want to make sure that any witness statement you submit is consistent with your client's declaration and with their I-589. As with everything that you submit in an asylum application, you want to make sure that those things are consistent. So your client may actually ask you that they want to include a statement by somebody. And so you'll want to think about like, what does this add to the case? Is this helpful? Does this add anything? Also, sometimes clients may ask you about a statement from someone where it really doesn't add anything to the case. And so it's not necessarily going to be helpful. For instance, I was just working with a pro bono team whose client, I think his brother had been an interpreter in Afghanistan, but they had already like work badges from the brother to prove that he had done that. But they were thinking, well, maybe it would be helpful for this US soldier that the brother had worked with to submit a statement, and that also the brother could talk about danger that the family might be in right now. And that wouldn't necessarily add anything to the case. They already had plenty of evidence that the brother had been an interpreter, and this US soldier in the United States doesn't really have any personal knowledge at this point of what's going on in Afghanistan. He's not a country expert, so it's not necessarily going to hurt the case, but it's really not necessarily going to be worth it to put in a statement from him that's not going to add anything that isn't already there. It can be helpful, though, if you're able to get statements from family members who are back in Afghanistan about events that have taken place, especially since your client left, and you can, have people send things through email, they can send things through WhatsApp. There's no, you're not an immigration court, so there's not like federal rules of evidence that you worry about here. You're going to want to submit a statement in whatever way might be possible for people, but that can be helpful. Sometimes too, people might want to submit a voicemail message. They may have received a voicemail message from a family member, which in a sense would function as a witness statement. Keep in mind, of course, anything you submit to the asylum office needs to be translated, but also that the asylum office does not accept audio files or video files. So anything that you want to give them that's like an audio or video, you're going to need to, for an audio file, you're going to need someone to transcribe it and provide a translation. And for a video, you would need to provide screenshots. And in terms of how to put together the witness statement, which is on our next slide, you're really going to want to think about the details to include. Will mean the witness should really be explaining who he or she is and how he or she knows your client. What's the relationship? How do they know each other? And, why should, in other words, why should the asylum officer listen to this person? How does this person know your client and come to have personal knowledge of these facts related to your client? So that absolutely should be in there. Then the witness should be explaining, again, how they have the personal knowledge of this particular event or fact that they're describing. And then really go into detail about whatever it is that they are providing evidence about. You may well not be able to sit with a witness the way that you do with a client. That's actually, that might not happen. It might, but it might not. And it's absolutely fine to have the witness either maybe talk to you, and that could be a helpful way to do this, like have a conversation on the phone or by WhatsApp to essentially do what you do with your client and write out the statement. You also may just be in a position though where you're going to need to ask the witness to draft something, and you'll then go back and see. You may have to go back and forth a few times to figure out, does this work? Does this make sense? Do you have concerns? You may need to go back and forth. And again, also just, being careful too about not including details that the witness isn't totally certain of. And with that, I think we're up to our final slide, Chelsea, and then we can take some of the questions that are in the Q&A.
Yes, so we just wanted to make sure that we always provide any additional resources, particularly free resources to attorneys and accredited representatives. And so Vicina, we have created a full course on Teachable for Afghan affirmative asylum representation from start to finish. And so that is provided on our on the Teachable website, which we've provided the link here on the slide. And within that particular course, we have provided a couple of different sets of recent asylum interview questions that we think would actually be very helpful for you to look at when drafting the declaration with your client and going through kind of the initial information when beginning to work with your client. Because again, the declaration should really be geared towards answering the questions that are going to be asked by the asylum officer. So what better way to do that and to help draft your declaration than to look at these actual interview questions from Afghan asylum interviews. So definitely look at that and feel free to enroll and to utilize whatever examples of briefs or anything else that we have in there for you. So I'll just leave that for a moment and then we can go into questions. And Jenny, I saw one question. I was going to go to the second one that we have pulled up. So it says, I'm having a difficult time getting clients to focus on their own story versus the general situation in Afghanistan. If it feels like a cultural block, as other attorneys at our organization who are entirely working with Afghan evacuees are experiencing similar challenges. Can you speak to this challenge and how to address?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I, have some thoughts that one of the things that might be helpful is to talking to your, like, you can go through with your clients kind of the exact kind of questions that are going to be asked at the asylum interview to help them understand, like, this is what the officer is going to be asking them. That might help uncover what it is. But yeah, Chelsea, do you have any other suggestions?
No, I think that was that was basically gonna be, yeah, the information that I would provide. It just
Yeah, and I think that it
steps.
also could be, you know, as I mentioned earlier, because of the circumstances of the evacuation, there are, I think, a fair number of people who have not already experienced persecution in the past, which I think is somewhat unusual for asylum seekers, many of whom, like, it's a really huge decision to, like, leave everyone behind and flee your home and come to the US. And I have found that people typically don't do that until something really terrible has happened, or many terrible things have happened to them. But because of the circumstances of the evacuation, there are many evacuees who certainly would be in danger if they went home, but didn't necessarily have anything happen yet. The Taliban hadn't taken over yet at the point of the evacuation. And so I think that that actually might account for some of the difficulties here. And that one of the things that you might want to focus on in that case, then, when you're talking about people who have not experienced past persecution, is maybe to focus a little bit on some of those examples Chelsea was sharing earlier about with your clients. How do their religious or political or cultural beliefs and practices differ from the Taliban? How do they want to live their lives? And how do they think the Taliban would react to that? And what would happen to them with the Taliban if they lived their lives that way? And I see we also have a question about that this is all great in normal circumstances, but people are dealing with a large volume of people needing assistance. Absolutely. And there's, you know, we're definitely getting up to you know, people's parole starting to expire. And I will say that we, some of our partner organizations in the Welcome Legal Alliance, specifically the ABA, has developed some really great toolkits to help organizations put on workshops to help guide people through filling out putting together their whole application kind of in a group. And if you want to connect to us separately or to go on our Teachable website, we'd be more than happy to share out those resources to help you kind of walk people through this as part of a group, and not necessarily the kind of one-on-one approach that we were talking about more today.
And I see a question about the 1 year issue. Someone said, like, do we need to address the 1 year issue if they did not file within 1 year, and have that explain that in their declaration? So that can actually be addressed if, depending on your preference for, like, submitting maybe a small brief or something like that, a memo ahead of time, that can just be addressed really briefly in just a couple of sentences. Most asylum officers likely know and understand that as long as there's some type of parole or TPS status, even beyond the 1 year, that is an exception. But it's always good to just address it. The declaration, not necessarily it's the best place for that, because it's more of a legal argument. But if you're working with, like, a pro se applicant, maybe that's a little different.
And the 1 year, in terms of the 1 year rule, the 1 year rule is not applicable to parolees who were given 2 years. So it's really not necessary.
And I see one additional question about if there is a spouse filing as a derivative, is it best to file a declaration for that spouse as well? So with any additional statements from non-principal applicants, it's important that the information that's being provided is either, well, one, obviously being consistent, but if there is an additional part to the story, or if there's something that maybe happened directly to the spouse that is in connection with the principal applicant, but is an additional kind of set of information, maybe they have their own experience, I think that's important. But if it's going to be very much the same information, it's not necessary. And I think, I know that we
Yeah,
are,
seeing FYI that the Chicago Asylum Office is shifting everyone to the border. So that's going to make interviews take longer. Thank you for the update.
yes.
And the guidance on the 1-year filing deadline. So Afghans who do not have parole, so no, if you weren't given a lawful status that lasts 2 years, then you are going to need to be worrying about the 1-year filing deadline. But also keep in mind that another exception to the 1-year filing deadline is temporary protected status for Afghans who, of course, are eligible for that, which means that you have to have been here since March of 2022, but people can apply for that now, and that provides another exception to the 1-year filing deadline. And I think we're over time, but maybe we can just take this one last question or two. Do you have your interpreter sign a statement of confidentiality before each client meeting? No, unless you have a different interpreter. So and if you're working with the same interpreter, I would only have them sign that once. Feel like including a spouse's statement in the form of a witness statement will just be discounted. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. Certainly, like, it can be helpful to include a spouse's statement. And the asylum officer could decide if the spouse is there in the United States and included as a derivative on the application, and so will have to come along to the interview anyway. The officer might well want to question that person, and they're going to, the spouses will be, the derivative spouse isn't going to be there listening to the principal answer questions. So it's really important that their answers be consistent with each other. I would not let that concern stop you from including a spouse's witness statement.
Okay, well, I think that we are, yeah, we've stayed over a few additional minutes, and so we appreciate your patience and appreciate you staying through and waiting for us at the beginning. We really hope that these details and tips really help you and your team with providing support for these cases coming up. And we suggest that you, again, check out like our Teachable course, which is free, and you can access tons of examples and samples of a lot of different things, and really informational videos and handouts that you can look at. And so with that, we hope to be able to provide another training on other relevant topics very soon, hopefully one next month, and we'll be able to provide more information about that. Until then, we appreciate the support of Welcome Legal Alliance, as always, for helping us to continue to do this work. And this information will be provided, the recording and the slides will be provided on our website. This is the current website where a lot of that is being posted, which is on the screen right now. Soon that will be updated, and we'll be able to provide the updated link. But if you have any questions about that information, feel free to contact Vicina. And thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.